Hello, welcome back to the course. We've covered so far a lot of aspects of aging that I think have focused largely on topics that are a little more on the physical and cognitive side of things and focusing a lot on maybe changes in the brain and how that influences perception and cognition and processing speed and all these sorts of things, attention and so forth. Um, and so we want to realize that there's more going on. Obviously, there's changes in the social domain, and a key component of social psychology is also what we might consider to be personality psychology. I don't really have a lot of detail in here about talking about things like personality traits, though, of course, that is something that could come into the picture here a little bit. That's going to pop up here and there in various other parts of the course. Um, but the concept of social and personality psychology, or these topics are linked together. There's even a key journal in the field that is titled the Journal of Social and Personality Psychology. The idea when we think about personality is maybe to just think about your one sense of self and how we understand ourselves, think about ourselves, and define ourselves, our self concept essentially, is also very critical for things related to social behaviors because how, as we're going to see as we get into this, and also in the next chapter, because there's so much to cover here with social topics, we have two whole chapters on it. Um, but how we understand ourselves is very much connected to how we understand other people as well. This is called, broadly in psychology, this is called theory of mind. It's something that we understand develops in childhood, that children start to develop an understanding of what mind is, the fact that they have their own personal, private mental experience, and that other people also have personal and private mental experience. And we have to learn to do things like we have to learn to ask questions, to ask other people how they are feeling, because we understand that these kinds of things are happening inside of people that, again, are private and personal. So we need to understand now how this kind of process is going to change in later life, as opposed to, say, in early childhood, which is a good topic to cover in a regular lifespan development course or a psych of childhood kind of course here. So yes, I'm still dealing with my timer back here, which keeps shutting off every time I don't move for more than about a minute and a half. We'll fix that one of these days. So let's get into these here notes. So first things first here, as I was reviewing what I said earlier about we've covered a lot of topics related to cognitive changes and physical changes, motor skills and perceptual skills, and certainly it sounds like a downer quite a bit, all the things. And of course, one thing that's very important to emphasize, if we haven't done it already, is that aging does not look the same for every single individual person. These are all changes, everything that we've covered so far are all changes that can happen to a person, but they don't necessarily happen to every single person in exactly the same way, at the same rate, and they certainly don't all happen at the same time. So that means that, yes, by and large, aging adults are still quite capable of being mobile, independent, functional, and performing those ADLs and IADLs that we've talked about before. But nevertheless, there can and may eventually be some sort of loss of ability. And that means that we have to think about how this impacts our self concept that I was describing and maybe even our self-esteem, right? The emotional part of the self-concept. How do I feel about myself? Do I judge myself to be a worthy human being? And so we have to think about, issues like, well, what happens, for example, when maybe I'm no longer able to uh, do my job anymore, right? Maybe I've spent however many years, I'll use myself as an example. I've been a college professor for 25 years, but I've been in academia for 10 years, even longer than that, at least. So that's a long part of my life at this point, to the point where that career and what I do is definitely a big part of my self-concept, my identity, right? As a person is I'm a professor, right? So what this then would suggest is that what happens if at some point I get to an age where I can't do it anymore, right? I can't manage the workload that comes with doing the job. I can't keep up with new information and new ideas, um, whatever it might be, whatever, maybe some physical limitations that just prevent me from engaging in whatever the physical side of teaching and research and everything else that comes with it. So I might have to stop. And then I'm have forced to adapt to this a little bit, right? This thing that was a great big part of my self-concept is gone. So then the question is, how do I adapt? How do I modify my self-concept and change my self-concept to account for this loss, right? So we're going to use a couple of terms here, assimilation and accommodation. And I'm assuming you've had the regular lifespan development course and you've encountered the ideas of Jean Piaget before. And so you might recognize these terms from Piagetian theory. These concepts are not coming directly from Piaget. We're kind of adapting the idea to describe something that's happening here. So Piaget says that we have schemas, right? And a schema is this broad way of organizing knowledge in a structured way around a specific kind of area, topic, or something like that. Self-concepts are a form of schemas, right? We could call them self-schemas, if you will. Everything that we know about ourselves and how we understand ourselves, those are our self-schemas. So what happens when you have a schema, according to Piaget, is that sometimes your schema, when it's working and it's functional, it helps you make sense out of new experiences. It helps you organize and understand new experiences. And that process is called assimilation. So what this means is that if my self-concept says things like, I can do my job, and also, I have certain other levels of independence, like I'm able to drive and be independent. And if I need to go to the store to just buy a handful of groceries, then it is perfectly within the realm of my capabilities to get in my car and safely drive to the store and buy everything and not forget something, pay for it successfully, and then drive back home and put it all away. And that's a task. That's an IADL, right? That is something I can do. So that's all part of my schema, self-concept. What happens when, so every time I successfully do it, right? Every time I successfully do any one of those things, I can assimilate these experiences. I can say, yeah, of course, I believe I can do this. I go try to do it. Everything works out just fine. And I can assimilate and move on, right? What happens when things start to not work anymore, right? What happens when I start to have more trouble driving? I start forgetting things that I intended to buy at the store more and more and more again. Obviously, there might be some adaptations I could make, right? I could maybe make a more concerted effort to make a list. And I think I've talked before about older adults and their driving behaviors. Sometimes they make strategic choices to limit the times of day and the contexts into which they drive so that they make it a little easier on themselves, right? So, avoiding rush hour, avoiding bad weather, avoiding driving at night, things like that. But even still, we might even get to a point where even making those kinds of adaptive choices is still not enough and we still run into problems. And this might show up more with things like work related things, right? I'm still trying to work my career, my full-time job, putting in all of the hours per week, but I just find that I'm falling behind. I can't keep up with emails and all of the other tasks that I have to do, and I forget things and my effectiveness on the job, my productivity level on the job, it's just going right downhill. How do I make sense out of this, right? Can I assimilate these experiences into my self schema that says, hey, my identity says I can do this, but every time I try to do this, something goes wrong. Something is failing. Something is not working. So what we're faced with here is a challenge with assimilation, right? Now, one thing that I could do is I could somehow force an assimilation to occur. What would that look like? What am I talking about here? What I mean by forcing an assimilation? Well, this is kind of related. Maybe we could kind of make a connection to something like cognitive dissonance, if you're familiar with that. What we might suggest, for example, is I have some conflicting cognitions now, right? Some dissonant cognitions. One cognition is I should be able to do my job or whatever it is. The second cognition is I tried to do my job, but failed. Something went wrong. problems are happening, right? How do I resolve this conflict? And one possibility from dissonance theory suggests that I can add a third cognition, right? And a third cognition is a way of trying to justify something. And that third cognition could be something like maybe it's an attempt to rationalize something, perhaps, right? So that third cognition could be something like, it's my coworker's fault, right? What's happening is that I don't want to put it this way, but I could say something like, oh, the kids these days, they just don't do anything right. And therefore, when I try to do things my way, nobody understands what I'm trying to do. No one understands what I'm saying. And now it's because of them not getting me and not understanding what I'm trying to do. That's the reason why I'm no longer effective in my job. Right. So in this case, I can easily assimilate my failures because I can blame somebody else for them. I can say, hey, kids these days, right? It's not my fault. It's their fault. This is problematic for a lot of reasons, as you might understand, because now it's going to lead to a lot of conflict with other people, right? It's not healthy. It's not a good thing to just sit around and start blaming the younger generations. And again, I don't want to give the impression that this is something that older adults necessarily do, but you may have heard of this kind of phenomenon from somebody at some point in your life, and so certainly it can be a thing that could happen. So we don't want this to happen, right? We don't want to cause this kind of frustration and so forth and conflict that's occurring or could occur. But at the same time, what's the alternative to that, right? The alternative to assimilation is accommodation. And if you recall from basic Piagetian theory, accommodation is when we modify these schemas to make room for the unexpected, right? Novel experiences, new experiences that we weren't expecting. And so now what I could do is I could start to change my self-concept. I could start to say that, okay, I used to be able to do these things. Now I'm having trouble with it. So what I can do to resolve the dissonance here is to change the initial construct, the initial schema, to say, okay, this is something I can't do anymore. And therefore, I'm not the same person I used to be anymore. And that's going to influence maybe my choices about whether I even continue to try to do these things anymore. Is it time for me to retire, perhaps, right? Um, and this is the doubt question that I have here, right? Which one of these do we want? Because the frustration that comes with forcing the assimilation is problematic for a lot of reasons, but also this doubting of oneself, a loss of confidence, and loss of a self-concept that comes from just accommodating and saying, oh, I can't do this anymore. We don't necessarily want to go down that route either. So now we're kind of at an impasse, perhaps, right? How do we pick between these two possibilities? Is there some middle ground? And yes, and this is what my second point in the middle of the slide is all about here. Selective optimization with compensation. That's a mouthful, but what we're trying to get at here is just the idea that um, there's a lot of things that define a person, right? There's your career, there's your ADLs and IADLs, there's your leisure activities, which I didn't even bring up, right? But you could be somebody who is, maybe you're into sports, golf, and basketball, whatever it might be, running, boating, rowing, something like that. It could be gardening. It could be going to concerts and museums. All kinds of things that people can do, but they might start to lose some of these things as they age. By the way, I don't want to get onto a tangent here a little bit, but there's a concern here that we need to think about as well, which is called continuity theory. And continuity theory says that people are generally seeking continuity across their lifespan. They want to feel like they are the same person all throughout their entire lifespan, even though we go through lots of changes throughout childhood and early and middle and late adulthood. Um, we want to have that sense of continuity. And of course, careers are one way of providing continuity over a large part of our lifespan anyway. But leisure activities are also a part of that. For me, that would be something like drumming. I started drumming when I was 9 years old, and I spent too much time in my 30s and 40s not doing it, so now my hands are in terrible shape, but I'm trying to get it back. So I'm trying to get that continuity right back. It's harder at this point. But that kind of activity then would give me that feeling of being my old self again, right? If I'm able to get that back. So continuity is important here, right? We want people to have that sense of keeping their identities and feeling like they're still the same person they always have been. And that's where this accommodation business becomes really challenging because you start to possibly lose continuity. So, how do we maintain continuity? It is with selective optimization with compensation. What we're talking about here is I have to select, right? So let's pick out each one of these three words one at a time. I have to select the things that are the most important for giving me that sense of continuity. Is it my leisure activities, my hobbies? Is it my career? I have to figure this out. I have to figure out what's important to me. I may not be able to do every single thing that I've always done anymore, but I'm going to have to pick some things that I can give up and some things that are a bit more central and crucial to my life. And then I have to find a way to optimize them. So to optimize means I have to find a way that I can still do them at a higher level, right? How can I, um, you know, maybe what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to, um, if it's something with work, maybe I'm going to optimize by going into something like maybe you can do a phased retirement, right? Maybe you can do something where you can shift from full time to part time or something along these lines, or work fewer hours if you have that kind of freedom. But the idea is that um, you are finding a way to improve how you do it, by changing how you do it. And then there's the compensation part, which is to find ways to compensate for the specific things that are influencing your um, abilities here. So this is what I had mentioned before as examples like of being selective about when you drive, what times of day you drive, or being a little bit more mindful about making lists and giving yourself reminders, even using certain kinds of aids. There's a term here called a memory aid, and that's a technical term, but we use memory aids all the time. If you just have something like a calendar in your phone that gives you little reminders about when something when you have to do something, right? And you have to-do lists, and even other things like when people, older adults or even younger adults who take a lot of medications, you have those pill organizers that specify like the different pills throughout the different times of the day and days of the week. Those are memory aids as well that help you keep track of everything so you don't have to worry about forgetting. So these are all ways of compensating for some of the cognitive challenges that people can face. So we put all of that together, and then we're still going to be able to do some things, right, as we get older, and we're going to have continuity as a result. Related to all this business about our sense of self and our self-esteem critically is this guy Erickson. Now, we haven't brought up Erickson before. I cover Erickson a lot when I cover the whole lifespan development course. Erickson is a neo-Freudian. Erik Erikson is his name. And so he's heavily influenced by Freud. He talks about the importance of having certain kinds of needs that when they are not met, then we get frustrated about not having those needs met. This can cause changes in how our personalities and our sense of self can develop over time. Erickson's distinct from Freud because he creates his own definition of what the core human need is, which is a social need. He calls it then the psychosocial theory, and his claim is that people go through 8 crises over the course of their entire lifespan when it comes to differences in the kinds of social needs that they have at different points in the life. So that's very useful for talking about childhood related things because there's several different crises leading up to the famous adolescent identity crisis that Erickson is perhaps most famous for. But moving ahead into the later years, the 8th and final crisis of Erickson's theory is called the integrity versus despair crisis. And what Erickson is suggesting here is that what we're doing is we are performing a life review. That is, we get older, we tend to have tendencies to look back and think about our lives from looking back at the past. And we spend more time kind of looking back at the past than we do towards the future. And one maybe obvious reason for that, this sounds a little dark, I don't necessarily mean it that way. There's not a lot of future forward, right? So if you're 75 years old, then you've got 75 years worth of past to look back on. but nobody knows how much time they have. But certainly, and you're very well aware that when you're at that age, you're getting pretty close to the end of your lifespan, and so people now become more reflective on their lives, right? This is what Erickson claims with the life review. But one of the things that's very critical here for Erickson is that when we do this life review, we need to evaluate whether or not the life that we actually led, all of those choices that we made, were consistent with that self concept that I've been talking about, right? Over the course of our lives, we develop and form a self concept. Right. This is the kind of person I think I am. This is the kind of person I want to be. Right. And these are the goals that I have in life. This is what I really want to be doing with my life. And I want to make sure, of course, that I lead an authentic life as I live it, right? By being authentic, that means I'm being true to myself, that every choice that I make, especially about the big things, is really true to who I am and what I want to get out of life. And I'm not letting other people maybe have undue influence on my choices, because then this would lead to what we call inauthenticity, especially in areas like existential psychology, where those theorists get heavily emphatic over the concept of being a true and authentic, right? But this is also the same as what integrity means, right? To have integrity means to have some integration between your internal ideals for your own life versus the actual external person that you present to the world in terms of your choices and the behaviors that you exhibit, right? And so for that inner person and the outer person to be integrated is what it means to have integrity here. So Erickson claims here that what can happen is that if I look back over my life and I start to think things like, oh, I didn't really do this. I never tried, and I kind of never really followed through on this thing or that thing or something else that I really thought was important and wanted to do. And it's not that I didn't achieve all my goals, right? Because it happens all the time that people don't achieve every single goal that they set out to achieve. But at least maybe they tried, right? And if you never tried, then you start to think at this integrity stage, oh, I wasted that. I wasted my time. I wasted my opportunities. I wasted my life. But now it's too late to fix it, right? I can't go back in time, right? I might sit around and spend a lot of time wishing that I could go back in time and make different choices and do things differently. And maybe now I have a lot of regrets, right? But I'm still well aware that that's not going to happen, and I'm well aware that as I get closer to the end of my lifespan, that it's a little too late to try to do all of those things now. So this is when you start to feel despair, right? Erickson's claim is that people are going to have more despair over their mental health, their self-concept, their self-esteem will drop, and maybe even more anxiety and despair related to mortality, right? We tend to say that everyone fears death to some extent, and of course, sure. But so other people can be somewhat more accepting, especially when they get closer to the end of their lifespan. And that acceptance could come from kind of passing the integrity crisis, right? If I have the opposite reaction, which is, oh, okay, I'm good with the life that I led. I did things that I thought were important. I always made the choice that was true to myself. And okay, sure, I didn't get every single goal that I wanted to have, but that's okay. That's just the way things turned out. But nevertheless, I was always true to myself. I was always authentic, and I'm okay with that, right? So if you're the kind of person who can say those kinds of things when doing the life review, then maybe you can be a little more accepting over the end of life matters and thoughts like that. So I include this here because just like with the identity changes and adaptations, this is all very heavily connected to how our self-concept evolves at this part of our life and also how it influences our feelings about ourselves, our self-esteem, right? All right, what else we got here? So other things that we're doing when it comes to changes to ourself means changes in our social roles, right? So little breakdown of some basic social psychology if you haven't had that. A social role here, I have the definition, just a straightforward kind of a textbook definition. Um, Socially shared expectations. Let's start with that part, right? So that means that there are expectations for how people in certain rules are supposed to act, right? What kinds of actions, behaviors, even styles of speech, are all expectations, but it's socially shared. So, for example, let's pick an example of one like if you're going to the doctor, you're going to have you go for an appointment, right? Just basic primary care checkup. And you're going to have certain expectations for the doctor's behavior, right? You have expectations for what kind of clothes they wear. You want to see them in professional clothes and maybe with the white coat and the name tag and everything that conveys this medical authority, right? And then you have expectations for the language that they use and their demeanor and so forth. So when people violate those kinds of expectations, that's when social roles begin to break down a little bit and relationships and trust even begins to break down. But in most cases, most people are able to learn the social roles associated with whatever positions that they occupy in life. Here, I have a long list of the kinds of things that people uh, experience as roles throughout their lives. When you're a child, there's roles that we expect, children to occupy, right? They're supposed to go to school, therefore being a student and following the rules in school and doing your homework. Children also play and have a good time and so forth. So those are things we expect from children. We have we can be someone's brother or sister. We can be someone's boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or other partner. Uh, so these are roles. These are relationship roles and family roles. We can get a job and therefore we function in the role of being the employee. Maybe we are a more professional environment. So I have whatever professional career, a doctor, a lawyer, a professor, whatever it is, that again, maybe there's certain expectations for behavior and demeanor and so on and so forth here. We have roles as parent, maybe as grandparent, maybe as a caregiver. We need to think about this a little bit, right? Caregivers, when you have a family member who becomes ill, likely chronically ill, one thing that might need to happen is that they're not able to quite care for themselves as much anymore, right? They might need a lot more stuff going on at home, like maybe they need help with mobility. They can't get themselves in and out of bed. Maybe they need help in the bathroom. They can't get themselves into the toilet. Maybe they can't clean themselves afterwards and they can't shower themselves. Maybe they can't cook for themselves or feed themselves. There's a lot of things that might have to do. They may also have a lot of medications they have to take, and they need help and reminders for when to take those medications. They may have specialized medical devices that need maintenance and attention and so forth. And they probably cannot do a lot of instrumental ADLs anymore, so now they need someone to do all of those instrumental tasks for them. Who does that when somebody has a chronic illness? Well, very frequently it's a spouse. But if it's not a spouse, it might be an adult child. And if it's not an adult child, maybe it's some other member of an extended family or a very close and trusted friend. And in the absence of any of these other social ones, then maybe we need some professionals that of course probably cost a lot of money, but nevertheless we may have to resort to that sort of stuff. But that would mean then though that if you're the person who is the spouse or partner, and your partner now needs that caregiver, this is a new role that you have. And what's important here is that we need to talk about role change and role exit is critical here. So, from the perspective of being a spouse or partner, but then you have to transition into becoming more than just a spouse and partner, but now a caregiver to that person. This is a significant change to the nature of the social role that you once occupied. And the relationship dynamics between the two people involved also change quite dramatically as well. And then finally, another role, which is the widower role, right? If a partner dies, then not only are we talking about role exit here, because now the spousal role or caregiver role that you may have once occupied um, is ended, and you transition into the new role. But then, there, of course, there are expectations for how people expect widows and widowers to behave, for periods of time. There are different cultural customs, of course, about grieving, but again, there are certain expectations here as well. And of course, another component of role exit is retirement. So you have the profession that you occupy for a long period of your life, and then you retire and you exit that role and transition into the retiree role as well, right? So there's another one. So I'm listing all of these things because it just kind of gives us this bigger picture view that our sense of self is very much tied up into the social roles that we occupy. And therefore, when we are young and we are just children and students, whether it's elementary, high school, college students, that's different than when we are later on occupying very different roles, and managing and navigating these changes and transitions between roles is challenging. It brings a lot of challenge, and of course, it relates everything back to the issue of identity, assimilation, and accommodation, right? We have to accommodate our identities constantly when we go through these kinds of transitions. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to unpack the grandparent as social role. I'm doing this primarily because the textbook likes to make a big kind of thing about the grandparent role. And I think it is kind of a common way of thinking about the typical social role we might associate with older adults. Certainly, of course, though, as I said, the caregiver, the widow, the retiree, those are also social roles, and we can maybe say a little bit more about them as we dive further into these notes. So defining the grandparent role is not very easy because it's something that has changed. We have, and I have right here, 4 bullet points on what we might consider to be our traditional, at least Western definition of what counts as a grandparent role. Um, Emotional support and warmth, right? People tend to have this stereotype that the grandparents are supposed to be cheerful and loving and provide a lot of emotional warmth and support for everyone in the family. And in fact, usually they're considered to be the fun ones, right? The grandparents are the ones who spoil the children with giving them a little extra money, having candy around and so forth, and baking cookies and all that sort of stuff. And they're less focused on discipline, right? They don't have a lot of rules, and they tend to so they're spoiling rather than disciplining, right? Um, so they don't get angry and yell and things like that. These are the assumptions, the stereotypes, the social roles, right? That, of course, is only true to an extent. I didn't really put much of this into the notes, but there is also the component in the book that notes that and there are many custodial grandparents, right? So this means that in many cases, the grandchildren have to be raised by their grandparents for various issues and reasons that might be going on in the middle generations' lives. And that then kind of alters the grandparenting social role because the grandparent is the grandparent, but still has to take on more of a parental social role. This raises issues, though, of things related to what we could call role conflict, right? The expectations for what parents do and the expectations of what grandparents do might be very different. And when the grandparents try to act like a parent, sometimes it gets pushback, right? Sometimes you can imagine maybe the upset child who says, "You're not my mom or dad," or something like that, right? Because they're not expecting this kind of behavior coming from their grandparents, right? It's a violation of their perceived social role, right? Of course, parents oftentimes rely on their grandparents. I should say the parents of the children rely on the children's grandparents, their own parents, to provide this instrumental support, right? Parents have to go to work, so the grandparents are retired. The kids have a day off school for whatever reason. So can we bring you the kids so that you can babysit them for today, right? That's the kind of thing. Or maybe take them in the summertime. I remember doing that myself when I was a kid. Both of my parents were working, and I would go, and my grandmother babysat me all summer long up until I was sometime in my teenage years, at least. And then I felt I was too old for that. But the idea was that's instrumental support, right? When I'm 8 years old, I can't be alone at home all summer long, right? So we need that instrumental support. Um, and even financial assistance, right? It's very common for working families to still be struggling to make ends meet, and maybe if the grandparents have a little extra money, we're going to hope that they can, pitch in a little bit and help out when needed. And that's very common to see people asking the older generations for a little money here and there. Another component here is the idea of passing on traditions, right? So sometimes it's family traditions that, maybe we always do these holidays in this way. This is how our family does it. So we just continue to embody those traditions, and the kids learn through observation. Uh, but there's various other cultural traditions and religious traditions that could also be passed on as well. And so again, the role of the grandparents is expected to model those behaviors and traditions for the children and grandchildren and so on to learn, and then everyone grows up and passes it on to their children. Now, there's sometimes we might think here some stereotypes that we can have about grandparents. Maybe these are stereotypes that we can have about older adults in general. But the issue of frailty, maybe we might assume that there's some things they simply can't do because they're maybe too physical, too exerting in nature. So there's sometimes that kind of negative stereotype that there's simply things that we don't think older adults can do. Um, Maybe they're a little out of touch into the social world, right? So things like, the popular music and culture changes quite a bit, and the content of media changes quite a bit, and older adults might not stay in touch with all of that stuff. So then when their kids are talking about the newest music star, uh, the grandkids, I should say, then the older grandparents have no idea what they're talking about, right? So there's that kind of expectation as well. Even an expectation over technological incompetence, right? Over the last 25 or so years, technologies have advanced at a very rapid rate, 30 years, let's say, just because of the idea that we went from having, computers and personal computers at home that were relatively uncommon in the mid 90s, right? Certainly people had personal computers at home, but it wasn't exactly like every single household, right? To suddenly, by the early 2000s, suddenly everybody's got PCs at home, and then we get the smartphones, and this just keeps on going, and with more and more technologies and more complex things that you can do, and so uh, it there's some expectation that older adults who grew up in a world that was much less digital uh, might have some uh, challenges when it comes to keeping up with that rapidly changing technology and understanding and using that. That can be partly true, but at the same time, it's not necessarily true, right? There's quite a bit of technological competence, I should say, amongst the older generation. Many older adults use cell phones now. Of course, we should realize that because smartphones have been around for nearly 20 years at this point, give or take. Um, at least, when it comes to the very first popular smartphones, um, that anybody who is 70 years old now would have been 50 when that happened. And that, they were still reasonably young and therefore able to adapt and learn to these new technologies. So this maybe when it comes to people who were old enough to have never been exposed to much digital technology when it first started becoming popular. Maybe they were facing challenges, but it's been around for so long now that I think some of these technologies are quite familiar to many older adults. The last point about interfering, right? So here the idea is that oftentimes we may have generational expectations about things like how you're supposed to raise your children, how you're supposed to discipline your children, how you're supposed to even do basic daily things and like go to work and manage your jobs and your marriages and so forth. And older adults can have some opinions on those things that might be very different than a younger generation's opinions on those things. And when they try to offer their advice and their viewpoints, they might be perceived as maybe intruding and overstepping boundaries here a little bit. And so they're trying to interfere with your choices that you're making. Um, Again, these are negative stereotypes. These are not things that I'm saying that this is true, that this is what older adults do, but these are part of that social role, right? This is the idea of a shared social expectation that sometimes people think that this is what the older adults are like. So we need to kind of bring that out into the open. Um, we also have other things as well. So maybe once upon a time, it was common to think of the older adults as maybe being more towards like this retirement, not just in terms of leaving your career, but retiring as in spending more time resting and sitting around and taking it easy and watching the sunsets and all that sort of stuff. But the modern older adult is oftentimes depicted as being more active, right? So we want there's all this idea of active and engaged aging, where now they have the freedom and the time because they're no longer tied down to their jobs and so forth and their children. So therefore, they can do what they want to do and they can travel and they can do physical activity and exercise and they can engage in all of these various new hobbies and and explore new technology and so forth. And so this idea that modern older adults are in fact highly technologically competent and able and engaged with the world around them. And so that's kind of a newer kind of social role expectation for aging adults and grandparents even. But again, it might not be 100% true either, even though it's more kind of maybe framed more positively than some of the stereotypes. There may be reasons to think that this is not exactly universal. And I do have a couple of points later in the notes on that particular topic. Finally, it's worth pointing out that while we can define these kinds of social roles for older adults and grandparents, this varies very heavily by culture, by socioeconomic status, that's SES. That relates to that latter point I was making about some of these modern expectations. Not everyone's going to be able to do these things because of particular economic constraints, perhaps. Geographic distance is relevant here as well because the role that the grandparents play in the lives of their adult children and their grandchildren is a critically important thing here as a function of distance, right? So if you live in the same town and it's just a couple miles away, that's great. But if you live hundreds of miles away, maybe 3 states away or something like that. Yeah, and my parents, who are in their 70s, live in Indiana, and here I am down here in Florida, right? So that's a big geographic distance. So they don't get to see their grandkids, right? Um, not too often. Um, and then, of course, the issues of health and abilities and even lifespan, all of these things will influence the exact realization of one's activities once you get older, right? Uh, okay, I think this video is long enough at this point. So as we transition here into the other kinds of social roles to talk about here, in this case, ones that are related to intimate relationships, I think we can make a second video out of that. So we'll go ahead and stop it here and pick up here the next time. Okay, see you then.